Alright, we continue our discussion of the central nervous system with the other major organ of the central nervous system, and that is the spinal cord. So if we look at the spinal cord, it is made up of white and gray matter, like we talked about in the beginning of this set of notes. And information comes to and from the spinal cord via two pathways. Information coming into the spinal cord comes in via spinal nerves that separate near the spinal cord into dorsal roots and ventral roots. The dorsal root carries sensory information into the spinal cord, and the ventral root on the front side of the spinal cord brings motor information from the brain and spinal cord to the effector organ, and that could be a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, gland, or skeletal muscle. So it's important that you understand both the roots, the dorsal and ventral, and what direction information is flowing. So we're talking action potentials in this case. So action potentials are being carried on sensory neurons through the dorsal root into the dorsal horn of the spinal cord. So this is gray matter consisting of cell bodies and dendrites receiving sensory information from the spinal nerves. And then this ventral horn of the spinal cord is made up of cell bodies and dendrites of motor neurons, which is taking information and sending it out to effector organs. Again, it could be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands, or skeletal muscle, depending on what type of neuron. So if we look at these horns of the spinal cord, they're divided into different regions, and what the SS stands for, it's color-coded here down on the bottom. This very outer horn of the dorsal horn is carrying sensory information from skeletal muscle. We use the term somatic to describe skeletal muscle, so neurons, sensory neurons, coming from the dorsal root will end, the axon terminals will end in this region of the spinal cord. So this is carrying information from skeletal muscle. This portion of the spinal cord will have the cell or the axon terminals of sensory neurons coming from organs. When we say visceral sensory neuron, that means sensory information coming from organs such as full bladder, full stomach, nausea, chest pain. All of those are considered visceral sensory stimuli, and the neurons that exit those organs will enter into the dorsal root as it nears the spinal cord and synapse in this region of the spinal cord. The ventral horn of the spinal cord has two portions as well. Again, we have motor neurons that are exiting the spinal cord here through the ventral root. If they're going to exit and stimulate voluntary skeletal muscle, we call those somatic motor neurons, so that's this part of the ventral horn. Or if they're going to synapse on cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands, those cell bodies are going to start here in the lateral horn of the ventral root, or ventral horn, so that we have the lateral side here. So different parts of this gray matter are dedicated to specific types of neurons carrying specific information from different parts of the body. So that's what's shown here. The white matter outside here are going to be the axons of the neurons that originate in these areas. So they enter here, and then the axons begin here and they travel up the spinal cord. So the white matter of the spinal cord is going to be myelinated axons, and this gray matter are cell bodies and dendrites of these different types of neurons here that we see color-coded in this diagram. So when we're looking at the spinal cord, we can see it's not the same width throughout its length. It has wider areas and thinner areas. The wider areas we see in the neck region because the nerves for the arm and the head originate there. So there's a lot more activity, a lot more axons involved here, so the spinal cord is a little larger in that area. We call this the cervical enlargement. We also see it near the bottom of the spinal cord in the lumbar region. It's called the lumbar enlargement because that's where the nerves of the legs are originating, and there's a lot of information coming and going in that part as well. You'll also notice if you look at the spine here, it goes all the way down here to the coccyx. Notice that the spinal cord itself ends here, so it's much shorter than the spine. They are not the same length. The spinal cord is much shorter than the spine. And these are simply a bundle or network of nerves at the bottom of the spinal cord, which we call the cauda equina, which stands for horse's tail. And it's a large number of nerves that exit via the very end of the spinal cord, which is right here. So when we look at the spinal cord, we see the same coverings that we see in the brain. We have the dura mater on the outside protecting that spinal cord, and then we have the arachnoid mater under which the cerebrospinal fluid would be located, and then the pia mater that's tightly adhered to the spinal cord. So we can see how that pia mater dips in here in this fissure. So we have three protective mechanisms on the spinal cord, just like we do on the brain. And you've heard of meningitis. Spinal meningitis is when you have bacteria that has infection that has invaded the meninges, and you might find bacteria in the cerebrospinal fluid around the spinal cord. And that, again, would be diagnosed using when a patient undergoes a spinal tap, where they take a sampling of the cerebrospinal fluid and look at it under the microscope. So again, we can see how the spinal nerves out here carry information that's both motor and sensory, but as it gets near the spinal cord, it divides. Remember, sensory information follows the dorsal path, and motor information, which is carrying information from the spinal cord and brain going out to the body, follows the ventral route. So the ventral route is motor, sensory is in the dorsal route. And again, out here, the spinal nerves are mixed. And there's 31 pairs of spinal nerves. And this is what we call the peripheral nervous system, which will be our next discussion of the notes on the nervous system. So the brain and spinal cord, we said, were part of the central nervous system. And the spinal nerves, of which we have 31 pairs, and the cranial nerves, of which we have 12 pairs, are part of the peripheral nervous system.